The neighborhood was designed to look perfect, at least according to the glossy brochures the HOA mailed out every year. Every lawn was trimmed to the same height, every driveway was clean, and every mailbox was painted in the same muted beige color. It was the kind of place where people boasted about uniformity, as though it were the highest form of luxury. But in the middle of this carefully curated conformity stood one homeowner who dared to be different. His name was Daniel, a quiet man who enjoyed his space, his privacy, and his odd sense of humor. Unlike most of his neighbors, Daniel didn't believe in maintaining a sterile yard. He loved color, he loved art, and most of all, he loved yard decorations. To him, a lawn wasn't just a patch of grass. It was a blank canvas waiting to be painted with life and laughter. The first decoration that appeared in Daniel's yard was simple enough, a cheerful pink flamingo. It wasn't even particularly large, just a small plastic ornament stuck into the ground beside his flower bed. Daniel thought it was harmless, maybe even funny in a kitschy way. But to one person in the neighborhood, it was an offense of the highest order. That person was Karen. Karen prided herself on being the unofficial watchdog of the neighborhood, though nobody had asked her to take on that role. She believed it was her duty to enforce the standards of perfection, even beyond what the HOA rules actually stated. Her front lawn was immaculate, her hedges trimmed like military cadets standing in a line, and her porch painted a fresh coat of white every season. She walked the neighborhood every morning with her little dog, and she made it her business to inspect every single property she passed. When Karen first saw the pink flamingo, her lips tightened and her footsteps slowed. She stared at it like it was a criminal caught in the act. To her, it wasn't, just a decoration. It was the first crack in the carefully maintained facade of the neighborhood. If one person allowed a flamingo, what was next? Gnomes? Statues? Wind chimes? In Karen's mind, it was a slippery slope that would destroy the image of the community she worked so hard to uphold. Daniel, of course, paid no attention to her disapproving glares. He went about his business, watering his plants, mowing his lawn, and waving to the few neighbors who appreciated his light-hearted touch. Some even chuckled when they saw the flamingo, saying it gave the street a bit of personality. But Karen was not amused. The very next week, Daniel added a second flamingo, then a third. A small family of them now decorated his yard, and he found it funny to place them in different positions. One facing the street, another leaning toward his garden, and another slightly askew as though it were gossiping with the others. He thought it was playful. Karen thought it was war. She wasted no time sending an email to the HOA board. She demanded that they take action, claiming Daniel's decorations were unsightly and brought down property values. But when the board reviewed the complaint, they found that Daniel hadn't violated any rules. There was nothing in the HOA guidelines that prohibited small decorative ornaments. The complaint was dismissed. When Karen learned her complaint had been rejected, her frustration grew into determination. She began confronting Daniel directly during her morning walks, standing on the sidewalk and shaking her head disapprovingly, as if her discontent could somehow pressure him into compliance. Daniel, however, refused to be intimidated. He simply smiled, waved, and sometimes even adjusted one of his flamingos just to see her reaction. That's when Daniel decided to push things further. If Karen wanted a battle over lawn decorations, then he was going to give her one she would never forget. The next week, a bright, oversized garden gnome appeared beside the flamingos. Its grin was wide, its colors were loud, and its hat stood tall enough to catch anyone's eye from across the street. The gnome looked like it was proudly guarding Daniel's yard, and it became the centerpiece of his growing collection. Karen nearly dropped her dog's leash when she saw it for the first time. Her morning walks were no longer peaceful strolls. They had become daily reminders of her failure to control the neighborhood. Every time she passed Daniel's house, she had to stare at the flamingos and the gnome, their plastic smiles mocking her. She filed another complaint, but once again, the HOA dismissed it. Daniel was still within the rules. Word began to spread around the neighborhood. Some residents were annoyed by the decorations, but many others found them hilarious. Kids pointed and laughed, and some homeowners even confessed they secretly enjoyed watching Karen lose her composure every morning. Daniel was quickly becoming a quiet hero in the neighborhood, a symbol of resistance against Karen's obsession with control. But Daniel wasn't finished. He had only just begun. What started as a single pink flamingo was about to turn into a collection so outrageous that even the most patient neighbors couldn't ignore it. And Karen, well, she was about to experience a kind of torment she had never anticipated. Because every morning, on every walk, Daniel's decorations would be there waiting for her, and each day there would be more. The pink flamingos and the cheerful gnome had been only the beginning. For Daniel, the spark of creativity had been lit, and now he saw his lawn not as a piece of grass, but as a stage where he could quietly perform his little rebellion. What had started as a playful joke was rapidly becoming something bigger. The first expansion came in the form of a windmill. Not a towering structure, but a small, colorful wooden windmill that spun gently in the breeze. Its blades creaked softly, catching the morning light as it turned lazily with the wind. Daniel positioned it perfectly so that Karen would see it the moment she came around the corner on her daily walk. And sure enough, she did. The day she spotted the windmill, her jaw tightened, and her little dog tugged nervously at its leash as if even it could sense her rising anger. Karen's complaints grew louder. She didn't just glare anymore. She lingered. She stopped on the sidewalk, muttering to herself as though rehearsing the speech she would give at the next HOA meeting. She snapped photos with her phone, zooming in dramatically as though she were collecting evidence for a crime. But the HOA, yet again, found no fault. Decorations were allowed so long as they didn't obstruct pathways or become safety hazards. Daniel's collection was perfectly legal. This rejection only fueled Karen's frustration. Every morning, her walks turned into a gauntlet of humiliation. Where once she had enjoyed her routine, now she dreaded passing Daniel's home. But that dread was precisely what Daniel enjoyed. He wasn't a loud man. He wasn't confrontational. But he believed in subtle victories, the kind that unfolded slowly, painfully, and with a touch of humor. And so, the collection grew. Soon after the windmill, a pair of garden frogs appeared. They were cartoonishly large, painted bright green with wide, bulging eyes. One held a fishing rod, the other a banjo. Daniel placed them strategically at the edge of his flower bed, angled in such a way that they seemed to be staring directly at Karen whenever she passed by. Their glassy eyes followed her, day after day, and she hated it. The neighborhood began buzzing. Neighbors exchanged whispers on sidewalks and over backyard fences. Some rolled their eyes and muttered about tacky decorations, but others began to smile every time. They saw a new addition. Children were delighted, treating Daniel's yard as though it were a mini theme park. They laughed at the flamingos, pointed at the frogs, and cheered when they noticed something new. Karen, however, saw none of the humor. For her, each new decoration was an escalation in a war she was rapidly losing. She doubled her efforts with the HOA, drafting long, angry letters filled with exaggerated claims. She insisted Daniel's lawn was ruining the reputation of the community and scaring children. The board reviewed her claims, but once again Daniel's decorations passed inspection. The rejection letters drove Karen mad. In her eyes, the HOA was failing at its most basic duty, to protect the neighborhood from chaos. She began attending board meetings more frequently, taking every opportunity to complain. Other residents grew tired of hearing her rants, rolling their eyes as she raised her hand for the 5th time in a single evening. Meanwhile, Daniel kept expanding. He added a large, brightly colored pinwheel that spun furiously whenever the wind picked up. He placed a stone statue of a turtle near his walkway, its shell painted with intricate patterns that caught the sunlight. A small solar-powered lantern shaped like a mushroom appeared beside it, glowing faintly at night and giving the yard a whimsical charm. And yet, Daniel wasn't doing this only for himself anymore. At first it had been a joke, then a quiet form of resistance, but now he realized the entire neighborhood was watching. Every new addition sparked gossip, amusement, or outrage. His lawn had become a spectacle, and Karen's reactions were fueling its popularity. She was the unwilling star of the show. Karen's walks became unbearable. Her once proud routine of patrolling the neighborhood with her little dog had turned into an exercise in misery. Each morning she tried to prepare herself, but the sight of Daniel's lawn decorations sent her into a spiral of frustration. Her dog tugged eagerly past the house, as though even it sensed the growing tension. But Daniel wasn't done yet. He had a plan. He wanted to take things further, to create a collection so bold and unavoidable that Karen wouldn't just dislike it. She would be forced to confront it every single day. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to argue. All he had to do was keep decorating, one piece at a time. Then came the pièce de résistance, a life-sized plastic deer. Daniel set it near the edge of his yard, its head raised proudly as though guarding the flock of flamingos and the army of frogs. The deer looked so real at first glance that drivers slowed down when passing by, squinting to confirm it wasn't alive. Children squealed with excitement, neighbors chuckled, and Karen nearly lost her composure entirely. When she first saw it, she froze on the sidewalk, clutching her dog's leash so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her face flushed with anger, and she stomped away, muttering under her breath. But the next day, she couldn't avoid it, and the day after that, it was still there. The deer stood tall and proud, day after day, silently mocking her every time she passed. Karen's obsession deepened. She could no longer enjoy her home without thinking about Daniel's lawn. Every curtain she drew open, every glance down the street, reminded her of the decorations. It wasn't just a yard anymore. It was a daily reminder of her powerlessness. And Daniel? He remained calm, watering his plants, sipping his morning coffee, and tending to his whimsical army of ornaments. He never raised his voice, never argued, and never engaged in Karen's theatrics. His silence was louder than any confrontation. But Karen was far from finished. In her mind, this was not just about decorations. It was about control. And she would do anything to take it back. The battle of the lawn had only just begun. By now, Daniel's lawn had transformed from a simple patch of green into something closer to a roadside attraction. Pink flamingos, frogs, a windmill, a proud gnome, and even the life-sized deer stood proudly in full view of the street. Cars slowed when they passed, neighbors stopped to chuckle, and children tugged at their parents' hands to see the funny yard again. For most of the neighborhood, it had become harmless entertainment. But for Karen, it was unbearable. Every morning, her walk with her little dog turned into a confrontation she could not escape. Each ornament seemed to multiply in her mind, growing larger and brighter, laughing at her from Daniel's front lawn. She couldn't stop herself from ranting about it at every opportunity. She buttonholed her neighbors, warning them that Daniel's lawn was destroying property values and turning the community into a circus. Some nodded politely and excused themselves, while others smirked, amused by how much the decorations had gotten under her skin. But in Karen's mind, she was the only one fighting for the dignity of the neighborhood. If the HOA wouldn't take action, then she would. Her first strike was small, almost petty. One evening, under the cover of twilight, Karen crept along the sidewalk with a can of black spray paint hidden in her tote bag. Her plan was simple. Deface one of Daniel's flamingos, make it look dirty, unattractive, maybe even frightening. If his collection lost its charm, she thought, the neighbors would finally agree with her complaints. She waited until the street was quiet, her little dog tugging at its leash impatiently as she pulled the spray can free. She shook it nervously, eyes darting to make sure no one was watching. Then, quickly, She stepped toward the flamingo nearest to the sidewalk. But what Karen hadn't anticipated was Daniel's security camera. He had installed it months earlier, long before the lawn war began, as a simple precaution. The small black lens caught everything. Karen's steps, ping onto the edge of his yard, can in hand, and spraying a streak of paint across the flamingo's bright pink body. The next morning, Daniel reviewed the footage and felt a slow smile spread across his face. Karen had crossed a line, and now he had proof. He printed still shots from the video and delivered them directly to the HOA board, filing an official complaint against her. The fallout was immediate. The HOA, which had tolerated Karen's endless stream of baseless complaints, could not ignore evidence of vandalism. A warning letter was issued, and she was fined for property damage. Worse still, word spread quickly among the neighbors. Whispers of "Karen got caught" circulated, and her reputation, once that of the self-proclaimed watchdog, began to crumble. But Karen refused to back down. She fumed over the fine, insisting that Daniel had entrapped her with his decorations. In her mind, she wasn't the villain, she was the victim. She doubled down on her efforts, showing up at board meetings with binders full of exaggerated claims, demanding stricter rules on lawn decor. The HOA board, weary of her constant disruptions, agreed to review the guidelines, but the process would take months. In the meantime, Daniel was still free to decorate as he pleased. And he did. Oh, how he did. Within days, a new addition appeared. A giant, grinning sunflower made of painted metal, its petals wide and golden, spinning gently with the wind. Then came a small, solar-powered fountain with water trickling down into a bird bath. The sound of running water drifted pleasantly across the yard, attracting real birds that perched happily on the rim. Karen's morning walks became torture. Every step past Daniel's home was another reminder of her failure to control him. She began walking faster, dragging her dog along, but she couldn't escape the sight. The deer stood tall, the frogs stared, the flamingos danced in the wind, and now birds splashed merrily in the fountain. It was all too much. Her frustration began spilling into her personal life. She stayed up late, drafting angry letters and emails. She called the HOA president so often that he stopped answering her calls. She even began knocking on neighbors' doors, trying to rally support. But most simply shrugged or closed the door. The truth was, many of them enjoyed Daniel's decorations far more than they cared about Karen's obsession with order. Her anger boiled into desperation. If the HOA wouldn't help her, and the neighbors wouldn't side with her, then she would have to take matters into her own hands once again. Late one night, she crept outside with pruning shears, planning to snip the pinwheel from the ground and toss it in the trash. But once again, Daniel's cameras caught her in the act. The next morning, another report was filed, another fine was issued, and this time, the board warned her that continued harassment could result in legal action. The humiliation was unbearable. Karen had built her identity around being the neighborhood enforcer, but now she was seen as the aggressor, the one crossing the line. She was losing control, not just over Daniel, but over the entire community. Meanwhile, Daniel continued as though nothing had happened. He watered his flowers, trimmed his grass, and smiled as children stopped to wave at the flamingos. He never acknowledged Karen's antics directly, never spoke of the vandalism or the fines. His silence made it worse. The lack of confrontation left Karen seething, because she couldn't fight silence. She couldn't argue with a man who simply decorated his lawn and went about his day. But deep down, Daniel knew this was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She would strike again, and when she did, he would be ready. And Karen? Her obsession had reached a breaking point. She no longer wanted the decorations gone. She wanted Daniel punished, humiliated, forced out of the neighborhood entirely. The battle was escalating. What began with a single pink flamingo was now a war that threatened to consume both of them. The neighborhood had grown accustomed to the sight of Daniel's whimsical lawn. What once drew curious glances now brought knowing smiles from those who passed by. Children looked forward to their walks just to see if something new had been added. Even the mailman lingered, pausing to admire the fountain or snap a quick photo of the grinning gnome. But not everyone was charmed. For Karen, each new addition was like a thorn pressing deeper under her skin. Every morning she felt her blood pressure rise the moment she turned the corner and saw Daniel's house. She tried averting her eyes, staring down at her phone, or dragging her little dog quickly past, but it was no use. The bright flamingos, the gleaming sunflower, the deer, the frogs, all of it demanded her attention. She couldn't look away. Her obsession consumed her thoughts. Even when she wasn't walking past Daniel's lawn, she was thinking about it. At night, she lay awake replaying the humiliation of being fined, the whispers of neighbors gossiping about her, and the smug silence of Daniel himself. It wasn't just about decorations anymore. It was about her pride. Karen decided that if she couldn't win through the HOA, then she would win through sheer persistence. She began compiling what she called her evidence file. She photographed Daniel's yard from every angle, sometimes multiple times a day, hoping to catch something that might technically violate the rules. She measured the height of his lawn ornaments with a tape measure, scowling as she scribbled numbers into a notebook. She even tracked the times when lights came on at night, timing them with a stopwatch to see if they exceeded HOA guidelines for exterior illumination. Her binder grew thicker with each passing week, but no matter how much evidence she gathered, there was still no rule Daniel was breaking. The HOA board, already exhausted by her constant appearances at meetings, began to tune her out. When she raised her hand, board members exchanged tired looks. When she spoke, her voice trembled with frustration, but her words carried little weight. Neighbors began avoiding her altogether. Invitations to gatherings grew fewer. Conversations ended abruptly when she approached. For years, Karen had been a dominant figure in the neighborhood, her sharp eye and louder voice giving her power. But now that power was slipping through her fingers, and she felt it every time she walked past Daniel's ever-growing collection. And Daniel? He seemed to sense her unraveling. Slowly, methodically, he added more. A row of miniature mushrooms appeared, glowing faintly at dusk. A small, spinning globe of mirrors caught the sun and scattered dots of light across his driveway. Then came a wooden sign with cheerful lettering that read, "Welcome, friends." To most, it was an innocent greeting. To Karen, it was a direct taunt. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. Karen was walking her dog as usual, bracing herself for the parade of ornaments, when she noticed something new. A giant inflatable flamingo, bright pink and towering, swaying slightly in the breeze. It was anchored firmly in Daniel's yard, its plastic sheen catching the morning light. It was bigger than all the others combined, a monstrosity that seemed designed to torment her specifically. Her dog barked nervously, startled by the massive figure. Karen's face twisted with fury. This wasn't just a decoration anymore. It was a declaration of war. Her hands trembled as she yanked her dog's leash, storming down the sidewalk, her eyes burning holes into Daniel's home. That afternoon, she snapped. Karen stormed into her garage, pulling out cardboard, markers, and stakes. She scribbled furiously, her words bold and angry. "Keep this neighborhood classy. Say no to ugly lawns. Fight for property values." One by one, she hammered the makeshift protest signs into her own yard, facing them outward for the entire street to see. The neighborhood watched in disbelief. Where Daniel's lawn had been playful and colorful, Karen's was now hostile and angry. Her protest signs stood like warnings, but instead of rallying support, they drew laughter. Neighbors whispered, children giggled, and some even took photos. The contrast between Daniel's cheerful decorations and Karen's bitter signs was too sharp to ignore. Daniel didn't respond directly. He didn't need to. His silence once again spoke louder than any words. He continued watering his plants, smiling at passing neighbors, and making small adjustments to his decorations. The inflatable flamingo swayed proudly in the background, towering over Karen's angry signs. The HOA board, exasperated, called Karen in for a private meeting. They urged her to remove the signs, warning her that they violated community rules far more than Daniel's ornaments ever had. The irony was bitter. She had spent months trying to weaponize the HOA against Daniel, and now she was the one being threatened with penalties. The humiliation crushed her. For someone like Karen, who had built her identity around control, the realization that she was now the one in violation was unbearable. She stormed out of the meeting red-faced, muttering that she was being targeted and betrayed. But even then, she couldn't stop herself. She began plotting ways to escalate further, desperate to sell the giant inflatable flamingo had been the final straw. Karen could no longer bear the thought of waking up each morning only to be mocked by Daniel's colorful army of ornaments. To her, the decorations were not harmless fun, nor were they whimsical expressions of individuality. They were an attack, a personal insult. Her anger had grown so heavy that it consumed her every thought. She couldn't enjoy her morning coffee without glaring at Daniel's lawn through her window. She couldn't water her own flowers without her eyes drifting toward the deer, the frogs, the pinwheels, and that oversized flamingo looming like a neon sign reminding her of her failure. The neighbors had noticed her unraveling. They had once listened to her complaints, even entertained her demands, but now they saw her as an obsession-driven woman who had turned her personal vendetta into public spectacle. Parents ushered their children past her yard quickly, worried she might snap. People whispered when she passed. Where Karen had once carried herself like a self-appointed sheriff of the neighborhood, she now looked like a caricature of her former self, frustrated, isolated, and angry. But Karen refused to see it that way. To her, she was still fighting the good fight, and if no one else would support her, then she would take action herself. Late one night, when the street was quiet and the only sounds were the crickets in the grass, Karen crept toward Daniel's yard once again. This time, she carried more than spray paint or pruning shears. She carried a knife. Her plan was simple: destroy the inflatable flamingo, tear open its plastic skin, and watch it collapse in a heap on the lawn. It wouldn't be enough to remove all the decorations, but it would be a victory. A small one, yes, but one she desperately needed. She moved quickly, crouching low, her dog tethered reluctantly to her wrist. The inflatable loomed above her, mocking her even in the moonlight. Her hand trembled as she pressed the knife against the surface. The plastic hissed and split, the air rushing out in a sudden, loud gasp. Within seconds, the flamingo deflated, its proud head bowing, its wings folding inward until it collapsed into an ugly, wrinkled pile. Karen stood over it, her chest heaving with adrenaline. For the first time in months, she felt powerful again. He dragged her dog away, convinced she had finally struck a meaningful blow. But her victory was short-lived. Daniel had anticipated something like this. His security cameras, always watching, captured the entire act in crystal clarity. The very next morning, as the sun rose and neighbors emerged for their routines, Daniel uploaded the footage to the community's private online forum. It was undeniable: Karen sneaking into his yard in the dead of night, slashing the flamingo with a knife. The neighborhood erupted. Some were outraged at her behavior, others laughed at the absurdity of it all, but everyone agreed on one thing: Karen had gone too far. The HOA board had no choice but to act. Vandalism, destruction of property, and repeated harassment could not be overlooked any longer. They issued Karen a heavy fine, far larger than before, and formally warned her that any further incidents would result in legal escalation. They even discussed removing her from her position as head of one of the HOA committees, a role she had used for years to enforce her own rigid standards. Karen was livid. In her mind, she wasn't the criminal. Daniel was. He was the instigator, the one mocking her, the one turning the neighborhood against her. She stormed into the next board meeting, binder in hand, her voice rising as she accused Daniel of orchestrating a smear campaign against her. But her words fell flat. The board members, tired of her rants and armed with undeniable video evidence, dismissed her tirade. The neighbors who once avoided her now openly laughed. The footage circulated beyond the forum, spreading to social media pages and group chats. Karen became a spectacle, her name whispered not with respect, but with ridicule. Meanwhile, Daniel remained calm. He didn't gloat, didn't confront, didn't even acknowledge Karen's actions directly. Instead, he quietly repaired the inflatable wall, a flamingo, patching the tear and reinflating it until it stood tall once again. The very next morning, when Karen stepped outside, he even produced statements from several residents, testifying that they loved his lawn and that it brought joy to the community. The final blow came when he submitted the videos of Karen vandalizing his property, proof that she had been the aggressor all along. The case was dismissed. Not only did Karen lose, but she was ordered to cover Daniel's legal fees. The ruling was decisive, and the humiliation complete. When the news spread through the neighborhood, the last shreds of Karen's reputation crumbled. She was no longer the self-appointed guardian of order. She was the neighbor who had vandalized property, fought a losing battle, and dragged the community into her personal feud. People stopped taking her seriously entirely. Her name became a punchline whispered at barbecues and block parties. Daniel, however, didn't celebrate openly. He didn't gloat or mock her. He simply went back to his routine, adding a new decoration here and there. A second gnome appeared, this one holding a lantern. A pair of ceramic ducks joined the fountain. The lawn continued to grow into its whimsical wonderland, but Daniel made sure it never crossed into excess. He wasn't trying to ruin the neighborhood, only to live freely in it. Karen, unable to face the daily humiliation, began spending less and less time outside. Her morning walks stopped. Her little dog, once a regular presence on the sidewalks, was seen only in the backyard. Curtains stayed drawn, blinds closed. The woman who had once made herself impossible to ignore had become a shadow in her own home. The neighborhood moved on. Daniel's lawn became part of its charm, a feature that visitors pointed out, a memory that children would carry into adulthood. The story of the flamingos and the furious neighbor became a local legend, retold with laughter at block parties and gatherings. And Karen? She faded into silence. In the end, Daniel's victory wasn't loud. It wasn't marked by a single triumphant moment. It was in the quiet persistence of living life his way, in refusing to be bullied into conformity, and in showing that joy, even when wrapped in pink plastic flamingos, was stronger than bitterness. The war of the lawn was over. Karen had fought with anger, but Daniel had fought with patience. And in the end, patience won. Because every morning, every day, and every night, Karen still saw the decorations. She saw them when she peeked through her blinds, when she passed by in her car, when she tried to ignore the whispers of her neighbors. The flamingos were still there. The gnome still grinned. The deer still stood proudly. And above all, the giant inflatable flamingo, patched, repaired, and reinflated, still swayed proudly in the breeze. A reminder that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply refusing to be silenced, while back the authority she had lost. Her obsession had taken on a life of its own, blinding her to the reality that the neighborhood was laughing at her more than it was laughing at Daniel's decorations. And Daniel? He was patient. He knew she was close to breaking entirely. All he had to do was keep going. One more flamingo here, one more gnome there, and she would unravel on her own. The war of the lawn had reached its peak, but the final act had yet to come. Karen was about to make a move so reckless, so desperate, that it would change everything,